Jeff.
Do you want me to introduce?
Yeah, go, 30 seconds, but I want to get into this.
Okay.
Start hitting it.
Okay, on behalf of the Center for Marxist Education, I'd like to introduce Jeff Perry, who he edited this 2-volume of Theodore Allen's The Invention of the White Race, which will be available on sale afterwards. And he's also done work on Hubert Harrison, and he's a longtime labor organizer and anti-racist activist. And just to get right into it,
Thank you.
Here we go.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Casey, very much. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to focus on Theodore W. Allen and the invention of the white race. I'm going to introduce Hubert Harrison to introduce Theodore W. Allen, but before I do that, I'm going to introduce people here in Boston, Cambridge, to Hubert Harrison's grandson, named Ray Richardson. And I don't know if people are familiar with that name, but Hubert Harrison's grandson, Ray Richardson, came up to Boston University in 1968, and he was majored in film. And after Martin Luther King got killed, he got hired at WGBH, the public station up here in Boston, and within a matter of months, he was the director of Say Brother, which is the principal show in the community, and he directed it from 68 to 70, at age 22, 23, 24. And I've written some articles in the last 2 weeks, one on Black Agenda Report 2 weeks ago, one on Black Star News last week, and there's going to be one in Black Commentator next week. Long 11,000-word articles about Ray Richardson, Say Brother. I think personally it's an inspirational story, particularly the young activists, what they were able to accomplish. But I'm going to just tell you briefly, it was incredible. They called it Black Power TV. They really brought it into the community. They gave the community a voice. And when New Bedford erupted in 1970, they took the video cameras into the community for 6 days and let the community speak about the conditions that led to what was happening. And what happened immediately after New Bedford, public television, GBH station, the higher-ups, closed the show, Say Brother, and fired Ray Richardson. There was much community struggle. Mel King, Chuck Turner, people here in Boston know names, people in Boston know, and they were able to get the show back, but Ray Richardson remained fired. I'm just going to tell you briefly a little more when we get into the article. He leaves and he goes with his fiancée, a woman named Vashti Lowndes, who had won an Emmy. She's also in her 20s for Like It Is in New York, which is the New York City equivalent show. They go down to Mexico to visit his father, Virgil Richardson, who had been a Tuskegee Airman, came back after World War II, didn't want to deal with what he had to deal with here, goes back down to Mexico to live there. Down there for a month and a half with the father and ready to come back. They meet two people from Buffalo, New York. I go into all this in the article. The father has great suspicions. They go to Acapulco, and the two of them and a third person die from drowning. Ray Richardson was an excellent swimmer, right? Now, what prompted me, I knew some of this background, but what prompted me to look more deeply in this was the death of Malcolm X's grandson in recent months, also in Mexico under suspicious conditions. As I looked further into the article, and you have to understand, when Ray Richardson dies in 1971, that is in the period when Fred Hampton, Mark Clark, George Jackson are being killed, you know, in terms of the black movement, when Allende is ousted in Chile, right? And the CIA, U.S. government forces are doing all of these evil things. And as I'm looking in the Boston Globe obituary for Ray Richardson and his death from drowning, as I go right down under it, the next obituary is that of Jacobo Arbenz. I don't know if people know that name right off the top, but he's the democratically elected president of Guatemala who was ousted in an open CIA coup in 1954. He was living in Mexico, so almost to the exact same day as Ray Richardson, he allegedly drowns in Mexico, only Arbenz drowns in his own bathtub, according to the story. So that's out there, but why I think it's particularly important, all of that background, the family has great suspicions and they've harbored them for 40 years, they were being monitored, and we're paying much more attention to all this government surveillance nowadays. Some of us people knew about it many years ago also. And but what's also inspiring is what this collective effort of this Say Brother crew, and they were young people, and I think it's particularly relevant and important for younger generations. So So that's before we get into our story. But those articles are up online, and I encourage particularly people in Boston to take a look at it, because it's part of this tradition of struggle up here. Now, we're going to focus on Theodore W. Allen, but I always open with Hubert Harrison, and you'll see, I think it's for very good reasons. But I want to tell you about these books, again, if you're not familiar. This is volume 1 of a 2-volume biography of Hubert Harrison, the voice of Harlem radicalism. It's 30 years in the making. Volume 2 is coming, a 1,200-page manuscript. It's 616 pages, 116 pages of notes, very serious scholarship outside the academy, so I can do that. Inside the academy, they try and turn you into 240 pages often, right? And get your tenure. The book has 60 photos with detailed captions. It's gotten wonderful reviews from scholars and activists. Also on Hubert Harrison, we have this reader. This is 138 of 700 articles written by Hubert Harrison, who dies at age 44 in 1927. Putting all 700 of his writings on Columbia University's rare book and manuscript library. It's a project that's undertaken, so there will be free, permanent, searchable database worldwide. Father of Harlem radicalism. You get him down south, you get him in Africa, you get him in wherever you are in the world. You can read. You'll be able to read the writings of Hubert Harrison. Also, putting one of his books with a new publishing effort, a group called Diasporic Africa Press. We're going to try and get Hubert Harrison's When Africa Wakes into the continent and elsewhere, right?
Diasporic.
I don't know what that's about. Is that slept or something?
Oh, maybe mine. Right. There you go.
Keeps doing it. It's not going to make the bulb bed last any longer.
Oh, I know what it may be. Let's see.
Just,
Am I plugged in with my power? Excuse me 1 second.
you should be plugged in, yeah.
Okay.
I would try moving the mouth.
That is off. This one right here is off.
This.
Yeah, it's
I mean,
not-
I know it's the projector. I just don't know why.
I have
The
no idea.
fan went up.
Hit the power
The
again?
person who normally runs this
It's
is
totally
away on a
shut down. In fact,
conference.
the fan should be running on, which implies that it's out of juice. It's plugged in for sure.
I didn't touch it.
That's off.
Yeah, that's off too.
Yeah, there's no pilot light, is what you're saying, right?
Everything's off.
Try it now.
Yeah, the light
Yeah,
went on
there
in
it
this
is.
thing.
Try turning it on
try
now.
that. I'm sorry. I didn't
There's
mean
nothing to do.
There you go. All right, we're almost
Lose it
there.
on,
Sorry
yeah.
for the little distraction. 1 second. There we go. Okay. So that's a little background on Hubert Harrison. I'm just going to mention briefly on Theodore W. Allen, then we're going to really get into the story. Theodore W. Allen we have here. This is the new edition of his The Invention of the White Race. 2 volumes, 800 pages, 30 to 35% index and footnotes. 30 years also in the making. Great primary scholarship. The new edition has I wrote all the front and back matter, new introductions, bibliography, biographical sketch, internal study guides of 25 pages for each volume, because this is not an easy work to get through, and greatly expanded indexes so you can find things, right? There's more background on that if we get talking. So that's Allen's work, his major, The Invention of the White Race. And now we're going to start with this story, and I always begin with Hubert Harrison. Again, if people are not familiar with him, he's a brilliant intellectual, a race and class-conscious radical internationalist, known as the father of Harlem radicalism. We will get into this, and I argue he is a key ideological link in the unity of the civil rights black liberation struggle, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a
Do
second.
we have better resolutions like dim some of the light?
We can turn off the lights.
Same resolution, better contrast. and
Okay,
brightness.
people can read that a little better? Nice. This is Joel A. Rogers. Joel A. Rogers, a great lay historian and a journalist from Jamaica originally. Knew Harrison very well. You got that, Sean? You keep an eye. All right, the book's circling. Describes Hubert Harrison in his book World's Great Men of Color, which goes through 8 reprint editions at least. Describes Hubert Harrison as the foremost Afro-American intellect of his time. That's amidst chapters on Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter from here in Boston, and Marcus Garvey. So that's extraordinarily high praise. the foremost Afro-American intellect of his time, and the one with the sanest program. As an intellectual, and this is just a brief introduction to Harrison, but what I want to stress to everybody, my webpage is simply my name, jeffreybperry.net, and on it you will find all kinds of information for free on Hubert Harrison and Theodore W. Allen. And let me also say, these two people, they are both autodidacts. Harrison being described as the foremost Afro-American intellect of his era, never went to college a day in his life. Allen, here's what Allen looks like. Allen goes one day, reportedly, and he found it too confining and he left, right? And they are, in my opinion, two of the most important thinkers on race and class in the 20th century. And of course we see later in Malcolm, we can get into a whole thing on autodidacts and the role they have played. But I think it's very important to note that. So when Harrison arrives in the U.S., he comes from St. Croix in the Virgin Islands, which was a Danish possession at that time. He arrives, and like so many immigrants, has to work, and he's an orphan, right? He comes to live with his sister up in the area, West 62nd Street in Manhattan, if people know that area, in a 5-block stretch, 3,500 people, mostly African, Afro-Caribbean, very densely populated area. For people, Thelonious Monk grows up on 63rd Street 20 years later in that same, and this is before the IRT, the subway, gets built into Harlem. When that gets built, Harrison moves to Harlem. He lives on the most densely populated block in Harlem, right? So he's of the people. But to start the story, he comes, he's working 5 days a week, 3 nights, and he gets citywide honors in 3 subjects. They've never seen a student like this. He's only going two nights a week, and the headline of one of the New York dailies, the New York World, is "Genius Found in West Indian Student." He spoke or read 6 languages, self-educated, including, to a certain degree, right? Including in his last years, he was teaching himself Arabic and reading the Quran, not because he was religious, but because it was a religion of so many people of African descent. He read voraciously. When he died, it was said that he read several books a day. At first, I was a little startled by that statement, but it came in from a few sources. And then, to make this story short, I'm not going to be able to do all of Harrison today. I'd like to come and do him in full. But I inventoried, indexed, and processed his papers. His family gave me his papers back in 1981, and I spent many years doing this. They're now at Columbia University. But I've been through all his books, and he knew how to aggressively attack a book. You can see it by the way he marked the book. He could hone in on what it was he wanted to attack in a book. As an orator, Hubert Harrison was the pioneering soapbox orator, particularly in Harlem, but he was a major activist in the struggle for speaking rights. Both in 14th Street and Union Square, upstate New York. He gets arrested in these struggling efforts. People had to struggle for the right to speak publicly. He speaks on all these subjects, but a few things. In 1912, when he's with the socialists, there are weeks when he's speaking 23 times a week. That's morning, noon, and night, 7 days a week. Charles Blow of the New York Times did a piece about a month ago, a little over a month ago, on the legacy of the Occupy movement. A very nice piece. And in it, he talked about some of the legacies and the positive things that the Occupy movement had accomplished. I wrote a little addendum. Times didn't go with it, but it was supportive of his point, but I add a little more because on the date that Charles Blow's piece was published, September 14th, on September 14th, 1912, 101 years earlier, Hubert Harrison, according to the same New York Times, had stood and delivered a lecture on socialism in front of the stock exchange on Wall Street for 4 hours to an audience as far as the voice could reach. And they were occupying Wall Street also, so there was a little history to that legacy. But Harrison pioneers the tradition, which is picked up by A. Philip Randolph, Chandler Owen, Marcus Garvey, much later Malcolm X, and many others, right? And I think it's a tradition which we should encourage now, bringing it to the people in public parks and public spaces. As an intellectual, again, 600 to 700 writings, approximately 700 before he passes away. Harrison is an extraordinary editor. He edits, not the principal editor, but he edits the masses in 1911. He does some editing for the masses. Then he edits the first newspaper of the New Negro Movement, subtitled Newspaper of the New Negro Movement. It's called The Voice, from 1917 to 1919. People may have learned some history that says Alain Locke, 1925, the New Negro Movement. This is fully 8 years before it. the New Negro movement that Harrison is the founder of is based in social and political activism, but it's also extraordinarily literary. Every publication that Harrison is the principal editor of had poetry for the people and book review sections. So this is 8 years before Locke, and it precedes Marcus Garvey's Negro World, Cyril Briggs's Crusader, and the the Messenger of Owen and Randolph. In 1919, Harrison edits The New Negro, which is described as an organ of the international consciousness of the darker races, especially the Negro race. New Negro 6 years before Locke, right? And then in 1920, he becomes principal editor of Marcus Garvey's Negro World and serves as associate editor into 1922. His final publication, Voice of the Negro, is the organ of his final organization, the International Colored Unity League, and in that we see a little of the similar trajectory we see later in Malcolm X with his organization of Afro-American unity, a more broadly unitary effort. As a critic, Hubert Harrison was an extraordinary literary critic. We found 68 to 70 reviews that he's done. When he's working the night shift in the post office in 1907, he has 2 front-page New York Times Saturday Review of Books pieces on successive weekends published. Now it's the Sunday Review of Books. Back then it was Saturday, on literary criticism. He has 10 or 12 pieces published in the Times in that first decade. There are book critics today, members of the National Book Critics Executive Board, who have quotes, passages from Hubert Harrison on how to review books on their web pages. You know, exemplary approach to book reviewing. I don't know that he's taught in any literature course in the country. It's unfortunate. He's a giant. He goes on elsewhere to describe himself. Let me see if I have it here. Well, I don't have it here, but, oh, here it is. As the first regular book reviewer in Negro newspaperdom. That's his phrase. Now, somebody tried one time to say, well, what about William Stanley Brathwaite? He was before Harrison and did some reviews, but not regular book reviewers, you know, as this, right? Now, Harrison's not trying to unnecessarily boast. He was doing these regular book reviews in these publications that he edited. He's a pioneer, still as an intellectual. He's a pioneer black activist in the socialist movement, free thought movement, birth control movement. He's a promoter and aide. He understands the interrelation of the arts and politics. He's an aide to black writers and artists, Augusta Savage, a sculptor, Claude McKay, a poet, U.B. Blake, a musician, Charles Gilpin, an actor, and so on and so forth. He's extraordinary in that dimension also. He's a featured lecturer for the New York City Board of Education when adult education was the principal form of education for many people. And he would lecture at the 135th Street Public Library, at the Harlem Y, and lots of places indoors, as well as all this outdoor lecturing and talking he was doing for many years. And he was the only black speaker at the New York City Board of Education in a period when all the other Board of Education lecturers were professors from City College or, you know, Columbia, places like that. He's also an extraordinary bibliophile and library popularizer. He is one of the founding officers of the Schomburg Center, which grew out of the 135th Street Public Library. He and Schomburg both contributed books. Schomburg had more books, but it was Harrison who's doing what we're doing here. He would hold regular talks weekly at the 135th Street Library, bringing people in. He was a tremendous proponent of free public libraries. He thought they were one of the great institutions in this country. He wrote wonderful essays like Read, Read, Read. And in the book, you'll see lots of laudatory things are said about libraries, because in the 30-year search, librarians were repeatedly helpful. And they also, since I'm a union guy, I put in a little call for better wages and benefits for the librarians. All right. This is A. Philip Randolph. That's at the March on Washington. This has been commemorated recently, the march. Randolph refers to Harrison as the father of Harlem radicalism. This is in a period when Harlem is considered the center of radical black thought and the international Negro Mecca. So it's extraordinarily high praise, right? Hubert Harrison is the only person in United States history to play leading signal roles in the largest class radical movement and the largest race radical movement of his era. He was the foremost black organizer, agitator, and theoretician in the Socialist Party during its 1912 heyday. He founded the first organization of Liberty League and the first newspaper of the New Negro movement. in 1917, and then he became editor of the Negro World and principal radical influence on the Garvey movement. Historian Robert Hill writes about the Garvey movement. It's very clear that the Garvey movement was a component part of that new Negro movement. Harrison profoundly influenced a generation of new Negro militants and common peoples. When we do the longer, I have slides of him teaching classes on world problems of race. 68, 70 people in sessions like this. They're dressed up a little bit, but you don't realize these are working people who come at night. You know, they probably oftentimes had service uniforms during the day. I argue in both books, and I think people who are familiar with Harrison have no problem with this. Amongst his generation, he was the most class conscious of the race radicals and the most race conscious of the class radicals. He was the major radical influence on A. Philip Randolph, outstanding class radical, on Marcus Garvey, a race radical. When you take those lines of descent to when I grow up, that's Martin and Malcolm, because it's Martin who marches with Randolph at his side in the March on Washington, and it's Malcolm whose mother is a reporter for the Negro World and his father's a Garveyite preacher, right? I argue that Hubert Harrison is a key ideological link, and I mentioned this before, in the two wings of the civil rights black liberation struggle. The civil rights, the race class trend of Malcolm, and the labor civil rights trend associated with Martin, right? He is also an extraordinary internationalist, and he refers to himself as a radical internationalist, as does wonderful historian Joyce Moore Turner. I recommend you read her book. She writes about Caribbean radicalism and about her father, who was a contemporary and friend of Harrison's, but she emphasizes that. He's extremely knowledgeable on various areas of the world. On Africa, historian Winston James has written a wonderful book, Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia. It's about early 20th century Caribbean radicalism. He points out correctly that amongst his contemporaries, Hubert Harrison knew and wrote more knowledgeably about Africa than any of his contemporaries, and he did so without the arrogance that so often comes from people in this country towards people from Africa. On Asia, and some people have heard this talk now over this weekend, but on Asia, I have scholars from India writing me saying what Harrison's writing on India in the period around 1919 is the best they see coming out of this country in the role of British imperialism. It's stunning pieces, right? On the Midi and on China, never goes to college a day in his life, but he's delivering lectures in the period of the Canton Uprising in 1926 at Columbia on the Chinese struggles, right? And also down at NYU. On the Mideast, in this book, you will read lots of things where he writes about the Arab world and the Mideast and the developing nationalism and the struggle against colonialism and imperialism. So he's an extraordinary internationalist. Overall, his approach is race conscious, he's class conscious, he's scientific. Again, I'm shortening this, but one of the major developments in his life is in the first decade in New York. He's nurtured in black working class intellectual circles with Arthur Schomburg, John Bruce, Williana Jones Burroughs, a host of people, and he breaks from religion and turns to science to address social problems. So it's a very significant break, particularly because the church is the most powerful institution in the black community. I get into this in some depth, and we can talk about this later. He's an extraordinary internationalist. His focus and emphasis is on the common people. He writes wonderful essays in here on the common people. In the Reader, you'll see them. But he lives in and amongst the people. He's not a radical on high, right? His approach, in his day, he's a master of the two principal means of reaching the masses, the soapbox oratory and the newspapers. This is pre-TV, pre-radio. He's a big proponent of direct action. And part of this, and I try and do a creditable job, I trace it to a lot of his Caribbean roots in St. Croix, where there's a rich history of direct action mass struggle, and this is this is where he grows up, and some of his close friends. But the island had an emancipation victory, an important emancipation victory in the 1840s, a major general strike and struggle called the Great Fire Burn, 1878-79, in which women of the island played a major role shutting down, and and 6/7 of the island, the plantations were being seized, and his classmate and very important friend, D. Hamilton Jackson, leads a general strike in 1916, which is an event that really prompts the U.S. occupation of St. Croix and takeover of St. Croix. And one other thing about D. Hamilton Jackson, his boyhood friend of Harrison, it's important, and my friend Sean, who's here, who's a school teacher in New York and knew Allen very well, when Harrison was in St. Croix, he got a very good education compared to what was afforded to a lot of African American youth in this country, particularly down south. And one of the reasons was he had the advantage of a good black mentor, Jackson's father. This is a crucial issue nowadays, particularly in the cities. I think up here in Boston, from what I heard from people, but I know in New York, where we're, percentage-wise, we're losing black and Latin teachers. I mean, there's a whole process going on, and so people are losing a lot of very good mentors and people rooted in the community who care. But Harrison had that, and it's reflected. I mean, he did, you know, all this self-education work and pursued his thing, his study. When he dies, thousands attend his funeral. I don't want you to think he was not popular at all. He was immensely popular. The kids used to follow him down the street. They loved him. And Schomburg, this is Arthur Schomburg, Afro-Puerto Rican, who delivers the eulogy at his funeral, knowing full well how popular Harrison was. He also says Hubert Harrison was ahead of his time, and that's true, and that's one reason I think he's very important for us here today. I think he has much to offer, and that's why I think Harrison is going to continue to grow in importance in the 21st century, because he does have deep understanding, he speaks clearly, not playing games, he gets it, and then he explains it. Now, I just want to offer a couple of important things, about 4 or 5 more important concepts from Harrison, then we're going to get to Allen. Harrison, when he arrives in New York in 1900, and forgive me, I'm shorthanding many things that I would like to discuss, but here we go. You're with me so far, right, more or less? Okay, he arrives in 1900 as a 17-year-old orphan. New York City had just undergone its 4th great race riot. It was said a black man couldn't walk from 23rd Street to 42nd Street without being seized by a mob of whites, angry whites, right? Harrison commented, as did many other early 20th century Afro-Caribbean immigrants, on the contrast between the U.S. they entered and where they came from. And I quote in the books, particularly from Harrison, from Marcus Garvey and Claude McKay. Harrison used the phrase, he was shocked, right? And McKay phrases it very well. And here, I want to call your attention to this. He writes, when he came to the U.S., it was the first time I had ever come face to face with such manifest, implacable hatred of my race, and my feelings were indescribable. I had heard of prejudice in America, but never dreamed of it being so intensely bitter. And the point I want to make here is, in certain respects, there's a qualitative difference between what Harrison knew in St. Croix and what he encountered here. What was going on elsewhere in the Anglo-Caribbean, particularly Jamaica and Barbados, and what went on here. I'm going to try and explain what is meant by this, because it's relevant to Allen's work. But here's what Harrison encounters when he comes, and this is what prompted him to start writing letters to the New York Times. This is how he was shocked. Lynching. 4 men at one time in Georgia in 1900, the year he arrives, at least 107 African Americans that year at least, right? The difference between the St. Croix Harrison left, again I'm going quickly, and the U.S. he came to. In St. Croix of Harrison's youth, there is no history of lynch terror, no formal segregation. Class promotion amongst a sector of the African population is fostered. And white supremacy was not as virulent or as organized as in the United States. Reason, and this is Allen's first volume for the book was floating around, but Allen's first volume, the subtitle is Racial Oppression and Social Control. Social control is crucial to Allen's analysis and to what we're offering here today. I want to emphasize how social control was maintained in St. Croix. In St. Croix, you had a population only 5% European descent, 80% population was black, and 15% so-called colored, of mixed African and European ancestry. The 5% couldn't control the other 95%, so they sought to utilize the 15% to some degree or another. And they succeeded for a while until, when push came to shove in the 1840s in the emancipation struggle, free colored side with the enslaved population is emancipation victory, and that's a pattern that happens elsewhere too. C.L.R. James writes about how that happens in Saint-Domingue. The greatly outnumbered European ruling elite, for social control reasons, implemented a policy of promotion of a sector of the African descended population. So in St. Croix, going back, there was a policy of some promotion and landholding for a sector of the African American population. Harrison himself is born on an estate that was owned by 2 men of color. In general, you would almost never, ever find that in Virginia or in the U.S. South. Free colors. The principal instrument of social control in St. Croix going back was the militia. Free colored served in the militia and played a very important role in the militia. In 1834 in St. Croix there was a law, an edict of full equality that extended, at least nominally, equality between free coloreds and Europeans. Let's contrast it with the U.S. Rather than a policy of promotion of a sector of the African descended population, the general policy in the U.S. was severe racial proscriptions. Rather than a militia that is set, really focuses in which free coloreds play a key role in the South in the U.S., Anglo-American continental colonies, slave patrols were lily white. No blacks were involved in any capacity. And rather than an edict of full equality, what was the law of the land in the U.S.? It's the Dred Scott decision codifies it, but no black person had any rights that a white was bound to respect. So these are qualitative differences. All right, Harrison, we got about 6 more slides on Harrison. We're going to get to Allen. As a socialist theoretician, Harrison is extremely important because he articulates the first major analysis of what's been variously called the Negro question, but he's trying to deal with race and class in the United States setting by a black socialist, and he develops a number of, or elaborates a number of concepts, including that racial oppression is socio-historic, not biological. He proposes a new litmus test for the socialists, and this is in 1911 and 12, that their duty should be to champion the cause of the Negro as a revolutionary doctrine. That struggle has revolutionary implications. Du Bois makes this in stuff that's been quoted, and you'll read in all the classes and stuff, in 1913, but that's after Harrison. Duty of all to oppose race prejudice. Harrison is very principled and repeatedly emphasizes that, and he initiates a colored socialist club, which was a real innovation in the Socialist Party, and I go into who supported it and who didn't and why. Going on, key concept from Harrison. This he writes in 1911 in one of his articles on the Negro and socialism. And if there's a few concepts that you take from today, I hope this is one. Harrison writes, politically, the Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic idea. Presence of the Negro puts our democracy to the test and reveals the falsity of it. A touchstone is a black stone. You rub it against the metal to see if it's really gold or not. It's an extraordinary metaphor. I think it's one we can use in our approach to all our social and political action. Take an issue, housing, education, incarceration rates, healthcare, life expectancy. Let's put it to the test. How are black people faring and what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
It's a guide for political action as we move forward. He goes on in that same passage to write, true democracy, essentially, true democracy and equality implies a revolution startling to even think of. That statement, this is where Harrison sees the future in the distance, if you will, that foreshadows the 1960s, when the civil rights, black liberation struggle is a catalyst for every other movement in this country, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the labor movement, the student movement, gay and lesbian movement. And it's a catalyst for 2 principal reasons, because the cause is just and because it hits directly at how the ruling class maintains social control, right? So now we move on to the next one. I also argue, and since I'm at the Center for Marxist Education, I'll bring this one out. I also argue that Harrison, as a thinker, understood the twofold character of democracy in America. And I know Doug and the other sharp Marxists here know that this twofold character phrase comes from Marx explaining what's the real key to understanding capital, which is the twofold character of labor as use value and exchange value. And when I use this one here, what I'm talking about is Harrison understood that if it's a democracy that's a lily-white democracy, an all-white primary, a lily-white union, a red state congressional district that's gerrymandered so it can produce Tea Party after Tea Party person, it's a retardant to efforts at social change. Whereas if it's a thoroughgoing and genuine democracy, it's a force, for social change. And Harrison writes about that, and he writes wonderful things on, he tears up Woodrow Wilson for leading the U.S. into a war to make the world safe for democracy, and he's arguing, what about let's have democracy down south, and let's make the South safe for democracy. But that's for the fuller presentation. I just want to go on. A couple more key concepts from Harrison. Harrison writes in 1912, and this is crucial for a re-understanding of United States history and United States labor history. 10 million Negroes of America form a group that is more essentially proletarian than any other American group, and the Negro was under slavery the most thoroughly exploited. That's 1912, he writes that. Here it is, leading journal of the Socialist Party of the United States. Du Bois, in 1935, in his major historical work, which redoes our understanding of so much of U.S. history, makes the same argument. The labor movement, with few exceptions, never had the intelligence or knowledge as a whole to see in black slavery and Reconstruction the kernel and meaning of the labor movement. The kernel and meaning. This understanding of slavery as capitalism, slave owners as capitalists, and enslaved labor as proletarian is crucial, and for three principal reasons. I'm arguing, I'm saying, but I'll hear more. There's probably more. I don't mean to. But one is that when we take that approach, we are able to learn from the most heroic examples in our own labor history, struggles, the valiant struggles, proletarians, enslaved proletarians. Two, it helps us tear the covers off white labor's betrayal of black labor. They're not really workers, and all that stuff. And three, what Allen argues is it enables us to understand the function and the origin of the white race. And that's where Allen's going to take this too. Now, going on, here we go. Here's a last thing from Harrison for today, but we're going to come back, Doug, you said, right? We can do Harrison in full?
Of course.
Yeah.
More than welcome.
Okay. This is when Harrison leaves the Socialist Party, he offers what I say is arguably the most profound but least heated criticism in U.S. left history. And it's too bad we didn't know more about him for the last 100 years. And he writes that the Socialist Party, like the labor movement, has insisted on white race first and class after. It put the white race first before class. That brings us directly to the question, what is this white race thing? And that's going to lead us to Allen. All right. So here's Allen. This is Allen in the 1960s when I first met him. And Sean, again, my friend, the school teacher from New York, who I'm sure will contribute some thoughts later. This is when we knew Allen. And I'm going to briefly describe who he was and what he did. He's a working class intellectual activist. He's a former coal miner from West Virginia. He's a worker, a teacher. I knew him. We worked together in the post office. I did 33 years in the post office. And a librarian in his latter years at the Brooklyn Public Library, did the homework hotline, helped the youngsters. Good guy, right? And but he's a proletarian intellectual. Allen originates the white skin privilege analysis, circa 1965. Now, people in Boston may be familiar with Peggy McIntosh and the invisible knapsack and all this stuff that comes in the 86 and 87. Allen's is a qualitatively different, I think a far deeper analysis, and it's totally significant, and it's in the early period. We're going to get into what his analysis is, but what people should know is by 1969, the New York Times is talking about, in major articles, New York Times, how the national organization of SDS, Students for Democratic Society, has put out a call to wage a national campaign against white skin privilege. So you go on Wikipedia and you're going to think it all starts 86, 87, and it's not the way it happened, right?
Could you at least touch on Noel?
Yeah. I'm going to get into all that. And Noel is the co-author, and I was hoping, and I don't know if Noel is here, but I wanted him to come here. Noel is co-author. Is that no? I can't see. Yeah, I'm going to get into that, but Allen pioneers it, and then he works with Noel. I mean, if you read, I'm going to show you my article where I go through the origins of it too. But they're working together in that early period, and they're friends for life, right? And forgive me if I'm going too fast, and I'm sure. But Noel Ignatieff, who's up in this Boston area, co-authors with Allen some of the very important documents, which I'm going to point to in a second, right? So Allen also, besides originating in 1965, this white skin privilege analysis originates around the period that this pamphlet is produced. This is a reprint with a new introduction, which I think is helpful. Originates the invention of the white race analysis in 1974-75, and then his masterpiece, and this is what he worked his lifetime on, is the 2 volumes which are floating around, The Invention of the White Race, and they're first published in 1994 and 97. The new editions came out at the end of 2012. Here's my webpage, all kinds of free information on this stuff. Please come in, make yourself at home. We get you. We're just more or less getting into it. Okay, and here's my friend. Here we go. Allen and Ignatieff, right? One of the first significant publications in 1967, co-authored with Noel Ignatin at that time, but Ignatieff today, is White Blind Spot. You can link, it's available online. You can link to it from my webpage. And I'm going to show you a lengthy article I did which goes through all of the origins and development of this. Allen is part of that White Blind Spot pamphlet, is a very important section. Can white workers, he crosses out, radicals be radicalized? So it's very appropriate here at the Center for Marxist Education because he's raising some questions, concerning the struggle against white supremacy. He writes a very influential little essay, White Supremacy in U.S. History. He writes a critical review of Edmund Morgan. I'm going to talk about this a little more. Morgan, Professor Emeritus from Yale, writes a very important book on American slavery and American freedom. Michelle Alexander, who's a lawyer, not a historian, refers to Morgan very favorably in her work. And Morgan's important, but on some key issues, Allen takes issue with Morgan. And I want to call that to your attention because I think it's important.
Did he just die?
Huh?
Did he
I
just
think
die?
I think Morgan died recently. Yeah. All right. He writes an important article, again, I would recommend to people here, in defense of affirmative action in employment policy. This article, Race and Ethnicity, these are all, again, they're available through, you can just get them on my webpage for free. Everything I can put up there for free we do, or link to. And this one is on the Hispanic category and Latinos and what's going on with the census and definitions, and it probes some very important issues. I will just point out one thing that we all want to pay attention to is in 2000 census, from 2000 to 2010, the number of people in the Hispanic category who self-identified as white increased 4%. We want to pay attention to that, right? All right, and then this last article is a critical review of David Roediger's Wages of Whiteness, and maybe I'll talk a little more about that later, but very important. Now, Allen, he writes this book, the 800 pages, 35% notes. He also is thoughtful enough to write a summary of the argument of the invention of the white race, available online for free. It's in 2 parts. Each one is 50 pages long, but it's got a lot of information. And in this pamphlet, as I said, I have an introduction which tries to help people understand what Allen's doing. But I'd like to specifically call your attention to this article on my webpage, top left, The Developing Conjuncture, the Developing Crisis, and Insights from Hubert Harrison and Theodore Allen on the Centrality of the Fight Against White Supremacy. It originally started out as 2,500 words. I was asked to write for it, since we're in Cambridge. I don't know if you've Daedalus, American Journal of the Academy of the Arts and Sciences. I was a little shocked they asked me to write. And when I sent it to them, they said, "Oh, could you double it? This is great. You're free to write whatever you want." But and then I doubled it, and all of a sudden they advertised it for 3 issues, and they pulled it. I think they didn't. They'll go so far with what they'll publish. So I turned it into a 117-page article. But in it, I open up with some statistics. They're a couple of years old, but the essential points I make are how the gap between rich and poor is moving to staggering proportions. The gap is the widest in history right now. How working people in this country are getting crushed. And I go through numbers, and I pay particular attention to comparative studies, how we pay the most for health care, and we're 37th or 47th in the world, how we have worse paternity leave, worse maternity leave, worse social safety net, and life expectancy, happiness, all these various issues. And then I go through how each and every area is, the oppression is far worse for African Americans, and all the different numbers and how, when they're quantified. So I think you'll find that interesting. And then I go through with this, and what I also do is I think, because I've written a lot on Harrison, I really try to develop Allen's thought. So I try and lay out the development of his thought. I recommend people to look at it. If you're interested in matters of race and class, as I said, I think these are 2 of the most important thinkers, so you might want to take a good serious look. Now we get into the story of the invention of the white race. This is what Allen writes on the back of Volume 1 in 1994. When the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, there were no white people there, nor according to the colonial records would there be for another 60 years. Word white does not appear in any colonial record in Virginia until 1691. And it's not simply that the word doesn't appear, the white race as we know it was not functioning. It's what he argues very effectively, I think. So That's what he writes back then. It's kind of a startling statement. He goes on to argue there were no white identity, had to be carefully taught, and it would be another 60 years before it appears a synonym for European Americans. Here's another example. People may be familiar with this. A little over a year ago, Ancestry.com did a piece there was a buzz on the internet, some people may have seen it, about John Punch. John Punch is an ancestor of Barack Obama. And John Punch was sentenced to lifetime servitude. He tried to escape it was his bond servitude. They tried to describe him as an indentured servant, but I can assure you that John Punch did not sign any indenture. An indenture is a contract, you know, to be put. And John Punch runs away with two other people, and why Ancestry.com played this up so much is because John Punch was related to Barack Obama, not on his father's side, the African, but on his mother's side, right, the European side, and he's an African man. So that was a big buzz. But what I want to call your attention to is, for the purposes of what we're talking about now, the two people that he runs away with. Victor, a Dutchman, and a Scotchman called James Gregory. Still not white, right? Bacon's Rebellion. This is the big struggle of the 17th century in which laboring class European Americans and African Americans fight together, kick out the governor, they burn Jamestown, they control 6/7 of the colony for 9 months, and in the final stages, one of the people sent to put down the struggle is a fellow named Grantham. He's a ship captain. He talks about how in the final stages, I there met 400 English and Negroes, still not white, English and Negroes in arms. And some were for shooting me and others for cutting me to pieces. Then I promised him they were all pardoned and freed from their slavery, and in the final stages, 80 Negroes and 20 English would not deliver their arms. Still not white, right? You're with me on all this. Okay, Allen argues this is supreme proof that the white race as we know it did not exist. It's, Grantham's testament has significance that is beyond exaggeration. In Virginia, laboring class African Americans and Europeans fought side by side for the abolition of slavery. We wouldn't see that for the next few hundred years, right? Here's Allen's 3 theses. If you don't get much else, at least you'll have heard these. First, that the white race was invented as a ruling class social control formation in response to labor solidarity as manifested in the latter Civil War stages of Bacon's Rebellion. The labor solidarity, this is why understanding this is capitalism, these are workers involved and stuff like that is very important, but this is crucial. Ruling class social control formation. In 1997, a professor at Stanford named Frederickson, who wrote a lot about race and stuff, and big name, writes in one of the leading non-academic journals, the notion of race as a social construct is now an academic cliche. Everybody talks about it, race as a social construct. Allen says, no, that's not enough. You can't just say race is a social construct. And the reason he says that is if you simply say race is a social construct, you leave the back door open for the Dinesh D'Souza's and the Moynihans, and all these people will say, yeah, it's a social construct, but what do you expect? Inferior culture, inferior, this or that, right? You leave the back door open. You have to put it right where the blame belongs and whose interests are being served and who does it. Ruling class. Second, Allen argues that a system of racial privileges were deliberately instituted by the ruling class in the late 17th, early 18th century by the Anglo-American bourgeoisie in order to define and establish the white race, but more than just simply define and establish the white race, to set up a system of racial oppression. And by racial oppression, that means not simply racial slavery, but across the board oppression against African Americans, which is different than gets set up in the Caribbean in certain key aspects, and we're going to talk about. But what Marx is offering, since we're at the Marxist Center, Marx is offering the first major, I believe, fully blown system analysis of racial oppression, from a Marxist standpoint. There's been class oppression, gender oppression, national oppression. He's trying to really probe what racial oppression is. Third, and crucial to Allen, and what differentiates himself from so many other people who talk about white privilege, is this: that the consequence of this system of racial privileges and racial oppression was not only ruinous to the interests of African Americans, which I think we're all probably very clear on, but it was also disastrous for European American workers. Not people at the top. It's in their interest. They quote benefit, if you will, from it. But for working people, this has been disastrous, right? And he elaborates that continually, and this is central, and we're going to talk about this more. Here's how he comes to write his book in the 1960s. And Allen had a history in the left. He left the Communist Party in the late 50s, as did other people. He's independent by the mid-60s. And he starts to think about writing a book, right? And he talks about, well, he's a working person, but he's long been fascinated with history, very bright working person, fascinated with history. He goes, I have an immemorial identification with the ordinary people. That's like Harrison, that emphasis on the common people, one of the people, and a conviction that racial discrimination is a bad thing. So that's kind of his building blocks. But it was a changed ambiance, a changed atmosphere, the civil rights struggle, the anti-war movement, there was a lot of awakening consciousness. And it was influenced by Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, in particular, of historical works. He didn't know Harrison back then, as so many didn't, right? So in 1965, he sets out to write a history of the three great social crises in U.S. history, and referring to the Civil War Reconstruction period 1, the Populist Revolt of the 1890s, and the Great Depression of the 30s. This has great bearing and importance for us today because I'm pretty convinced we're entering a fourth great racial crisis, so we want to learn the lessons of these three crises. So here's what Allen found, and again, we're shortening, but it's elaborated more in that long article on the conjuncture. In the three periods of national crisis, characterized by general confrontations between capital and urban and rural laboring classes, the key to defeat of the forces of democracy, labor, and socialism was in each case achieved by ruling class appeals to white supremacism, basically by fostering white skin privileges of European Americans. That's the key to defeat. That's how they beat us each time in the past. He's suggesting we've got to learn that lesson, but I want to bring it home a little more. Here's an example. I want to get concrete. A lot of people, you'll hear people say, well, what we need is an FDR-type New Deal. Not quite. And here's why. First, there's a professor at Columbia named Ira Katznelson has written a book, When Affirmative Action Was Right. He describes how each and every federal program from the 1930s into the 1960s was shaped in a white supremacist fashion, right? Now, I come out of the labor movement. Social Security up until 1951, the National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, this major labor legislation of the New Deal, all excluded domestic and agricultural workers, which was 60% of the black labor force in the 30s and nearly 75% of those employed in the South. Particularly its black and Latin workers. This is ruling class policy. And why? FDR's New Deal had a troika of support. It was the trade unions, it was the urban political machines, and it was the Dixiecrats down south, those same people who are now in the Tea Party, or their fathers, or, right? Here's a couple more examples. Another is relief. Relief was set up, it's federal money, but it was controlled locally, and down south that meant great disparity in treatment. Two more last examples. Very important, and I hope people remember these. The GI Bill. Under the GI Bill, you get a home with zero down payment, low interest loan. I come from New York, North Jersey area. Here's what the statistics were in the New York, North Jersey area. Of 67,000 GI loans, less than 100 go to families of color. That's how you get the ring of white suburbs around New York and in Boston, every other city in this country. Federal ruling class policy. Here is the last one, and this one, well, people should pay attention to this one, and I don't think they do enough. At the start of the Depression, the black to white unemployment ratio was 1-to-1, which, if you think about it, makes sense because black people are brought here to labor, right? So they were being used as laborers, right? They were laboring. By 1947, after all those programs of the New Deal and the post-war deployment, the ratio of black to white unemployment was 2-to-1, and that's all anyone in this room has ever known, 2-to-1 or some variant, 1.9-to-1, 2.2-to-1 or something like that. And very crucial, again, ruling class policy. Allen argues in one of his pieces, and this is, I think, instructive, just to help conceptualize a little. He goes, in the U.S., we can understand the normal course of capital events brings a deterioration of condition of the workers. 2, at a certain point, we know black workers are first fired, last hired. They get hit hardest first, and But at a certain point, after the attacks have really been hammering away at the black workers, the substance of white workers' privileges begin to get drained. And then there's overtures, come on, brother and sister, let's come together. We got some interests in common. And the white workers begin to manifest a tendency. We saw an embryo of this in Occupy and other things, right, where people starting to feel it, they want to come together. What Allen argues is historically what has happened is between this period 3 and then in period 4, the ruling class has moved in various ways, whether they do it openly or by subterfuge, it's there, and to re-substantiate the racial privileges of the white workers. And he argues that what has happened historically is the white workers have taken the poison bait. And he calls for working people, these privileges are poison bait. It's like a shot of heroin. It looks good, but it's not in your class interest, the race privileges, right? And he says they have to be struggled against and repudiated and fought against. Got to push for equality, people struggling together. So that's Allen's. Now, that essay on the 3 crises, since I'm at the Marxist Center, I wanted to bring this into, is part of a larger analysis, and the people earlier today didn't get this one. But he was really addressing the question of why no socialism in the U.S., because he's coming from a left perspective. And he starts out in a theoretical framework by examining the 6-pronged rationale for the relatively low level of class consciousness in the U.S. Historically, that issue has been called the debate over American exceptionalism. Today they're talking about American exceptionalism in terms of but it starts out as a labor and working class question, and why does the U.S. seem to be exempt from the laws that apply to other advanced capitalist countries in terms of not developing a labor party or a significant third party, or things like that. So that was the question historically. You'll see it in William Z. Foster and some in the old communist movement. And from the various writers and commentators on it, mostly left and labor historians, the rationales for why that may have been the case. The early development of civil liberties, not for everyone obviously, heterogeneity of the workforce, the safety valve of homesteading, ease of these are all the rationales that are given. And they are given by Frederick Engels, one or more of these. Marx's co-worker, Sorg, who translate capital into English, Frederick Jackson Turner, Hillquit, leading figure in the Socialist Party, Commons writes the early labor history, Perlman writes the early labor history, Mary and Charles Beard, and Foster, dominant figure in American communism. You're going to see all aspects of that 6-pronged rationale in all of those writers. And Allen says that old consensus, that 6-pronged rationale, was seriously flawed, by white blindness. White supremacists has been the main retardant of working class consciousness, and he goes through each one of the 6 and showed that freelance safety valve had been thoroughly discredited for many reasons, including the bulk of the best lands didn't go to laboring people at all. They went to railroads and other interests. Heterogeneity, rather than being a weakness, was oftentimes a strength of the labor movement. The rise of mass he goes through each one of the 6. And this, disproves them or challenges them and argues that white supremacy has been the main retardant, particularly for people at the Marxist Center. And this is elaborated in depth in that article on developing conjuncture. I think you want to look at it and really consider it and go back to his more fully blown stuff. And this is in what you mentioned earlier, in White Blind Spot and Can White Workers Be Radicalized, those pamphlets from the 1960s. So what Allen is arguing in theory, we're still not getting into these volumes yet. The white race is a ruling class social control formation. It must be understood not simply as a social construct, but as a ruling class social control formation. The white race has served as the historic principal guarantor of ruling class domination. They rely on the white workers, being allegiant to siding with the ruling class as opposed to with their fellow workers, right? From a labor perspective, the white race, which is an all-class association, it's a multi-class formation that's held together. The key to holding it together is the privileges extended to the European American workers, is the basic, most prevalent, and historic form of class collaboration. People siding with the bosses rather than with their fellow workers. That concept again. He argues white supremacism has been the Achilles heel of the labor, democratic, and socialist movements. And white identity, he's really taking it out there now, is the main barrier to class consciousness in the U.S. and the incubus or the devil of white identity. He says is his principal problem. So he's not biting his tongue when he really gets into it, right? So now we're getting back to the history of his book. So Allen is working on the history of those 3 crises, and then all of a sudden, late 60s, a book comes out by a fellow named Winthrop Jordan. This is the Academy response to the civil rights black liberation struggle. This is what's coming. This is the counter, the ideological counteroffensive. And his book is White Over Black, American Attitudes Towards the Negro. You'll see it by the title. He equates white with American, right? This is Jordan. And this wins National Book Award and all kinds of awards, right? But the key argument that Jordan makes is that white supremacy and racism is innate, that it turned to white supremacy, white supremacism is an unthinking decision. That's his phrase, right? It's innate. And the implications of that are profound, because if racism is innate, why struggle against it? It disarms struggle against white supremacy. So Allen, in his work, in all his writings, challenges what he argues are the two main ideological props of white supremacy amongst European American workers. The two things that are used ideologically to hold back the struggle. And one is the idea that racism is innate, because if it's innate, why fight it? And two, the idea that white workers benefit, that it's somehow in their interest to support white race privileges and white supremacy. And he says, no, that's not in your interest. What is in your interest is siding with your co-workers and other working and poor people and opposing white supremacy. So these are the two main arguments. And in the historical field, where do these arguments, and going back to the colonial period, where do we see these arguments? First, we see it in Jordan, the unthinking decision, which I just mentioned. But second, and this is where the question of Edmund Morgan comes in, we see it in Morgan. And in his book, American Slavery, American Freedom, because what Morgan writes is in the 18th century in Virginia, and Virginia is the pattern-setting colony. 7 of the first 12 presidents come from Virginia, those founding fathers, right? And it's setting the tone, and it's the lead colony in all of this. And Morgan argues there were too few free, poor European Americans on hand to matter, as if they're being promoted into the middle class. That's the case in St. Croix. That's the case in Barbados or Jamaica, but that is not the case in Virginia and in the South. There are poor, so-called poor whites. There are these laboring class and poor, impoverished European Americans. And that's one of the key ingredients that Allen's going to talk about to why the U.S. sets up its racial lines, if you will, the way it does, because there were so many poor European Americans as opposed to other places. So here's Allen when he sets out to finally start writing his book. 2 volumes. I told you about the new expanded edition. Pay particular attention to words. Allen tries to be very precise with his words. So volume 1 is Racial Oppression and Social Control. Volume 2 is The Origin of Racial Oppression in Anglo-America. First, I want to focus on this. These 3 words. Since we're here, I'm going to do a little longer. Origin, racism, and whiteness. Allen argues, my book, and I'm going to preface this with, for 14 years, his book first came out by Verso, and they didn't even know what they were sitting on. His book for 14 years was, the 2 volumes were listed as anthropology. It's straight history. They didn't know what they were talking about, right? They ran a quote from David Roediger, the author of Wages of Whiteness, on the back, which talks about Theodore Allen's wonderful book on the origins of racism, right? And they list Roediger as the author of Wages of Whiteness. Racism, origins, whiteness. Here's what Allen says about each 3 concepts. He uses in his title origin, and he goes, the reason I do that is because it has the desired specificity, such as similar to Darwin's Origin of Species, Engel's Origin of Family Private Property. Because in choosing this subtitle, I meant it to be consistent with the argument of the book. Class struggle was the origin of racial oppression. What Allen argues, and he elaborates this in that first volume, is class struggle, the nature of class struggle, and what forms it takes distinguishes whether the ruling class turns to racial oppression or national oppression to maintain social control. On whiteness, Allen puts the term in quotes, and he stays away from it. He goes, it's an abstract noun, it's an abstraction, it's an attribute, it's not the role they play. He goes, this white race is an actual objective thing, not biologically, but as a social formation. It is a historically developed identity, it functions. So he's not saying this thing doesn't exist. He's saying it's real and it impacts. And on racism, he goes, my book does not pretend to be about racism. And the reason is, he goes, I generally avoid the use of the self-standing term racism on the account of the ruinous ambiguity which white supremacists have put. Well, black people are racist, everybody's racist, right? And he says, no, I want to focus on white supremacism and white race, just so you've at least been exposed to that and you're here. So here we get into Volume 1, Racial Oppression and Social Control. In Volume 1, Allen begins, and it's a very important historiographical essay in which he reviews a lot of the two main line debate on the question, I should have had it in quotes, of slavery and racism, because that's how the historians were describing it. And one school of thought is Winthrop Jordan, a fellow named Carl Degler. Allen calls the psychocultural. The other is socioeconomic approach, which Allen considers himself part of this, but he has certain differences with historians in each of them, but that includes the Hanlons, Morgan, Williams. I mean, he likes much of the work some of these people do, but he doesn't agree fully, and he explains his difference. One thing that's very important about Allen, and I find this with Harrison too, he has great intellectual integrity. He spends so much time in his footnotes and appendices. He understands the arguments people hear and questions people here will raise. He tries to raise them in their best light and address them, not cheap shots or anything like that, and address them. So that's part of the appeal, I think, of Allen. So, and of all the historians, when Allen reviews all the historians who have written on it, he thinks the one who really gets it best, who really understands it, is Lerone Bennett Jr. People may be familiar with Lerone Bennett. He's the senior editor of Ebony magazine for 40 plus years, a Morehouse graduate. His book, Before the Mayflower, was read by generations, has been very influential. But the book that Allen particularly cites is Bennett's book, The Shaping of Black America, particularly chapter 3, The Road Not Taken, which is developed from an article he wrote in Ebony in 1917. And Allen argues that Bennett lays out the three essential, what he calls the essential bearing points for the argument. Same three arguments that Allen puts. It's a ruling class response to problem of labor solidarity, racial privileges, deliberately instituted, and the consequence ruinous and disastrous. All right. And then what Allen does in volume 1, we have about 20 more minutes. If you can hang on, 25 minutes, we'll get into questions. He looks at some of the howling absurdities of race, because what Allen wants to do is he wants to, in volume 1, he wants to move beyond the white blind spot, beyond just looking at understanding race in terms of phenotype or skin color. He wants to look at the nature of the oppression so we can really learn what we're dealing with. So first, he goes through examples of howling absurdities of race. How in colonial Hispanic America, people can purchase certificates of whiteness. How in Brazil it is said money whitens. No such whitening in the US. He uses the example in 1890 of siblings. One goes to British Guiana, now Guyana. A Portuguese immigrant would learn that he or she was not white. They come to the US, they have become white, right? The next one I particularly like to pay attention to, it's Cuba, same country, same year. Spain on the way out, US coming in. The last Spanish census, Mexican Indians and Chinese were classified as white. US says, no, you don't got that right. Come in, they classify same groups as colored. And of course the last example, and this one in all varied forms throughout the history of the US, all the torturous definitions of what constitutes a Negro, 1/4, 1/16, 1 drop, and many others. And so then what Allen says is, given that, I want to look at racial oppression as a social rather than a skin-based phenomenon, and he wants to look at not on why the bourgeoisie had recourse to slavery, ultimately, but on how they could establish social control. And Allen is very clear that the bourgeoisie, if they will do whatever they can to get work out of people and things like that. So he's very clear of how oppressive racial slavery or slavery of African descended people was, but he also talks about how in England from 1547 to 1550, the same English bourgeoisie enslaves vagabonds in England. How there's the Irish slave trade. How in Scotland from 1606 to 1790s, there's the enslavement of Scottish coal miners and salt pan workers. So he knows that they will do whatever they can get away with, right? So his core argument in volume 1 is that if we take a look at the nature of the oppression, there is incredible similarities between Anglo-Norman rule and Protestant ascendancy in Ireland, the oppression of Irish Catholics, and white supremacy in continental Anglo-America. And that, he argues that, as well as the Anglo-Caribbean example, which I'll get into a second, demonstrates that racial oppression, the nature of the oppression, is not dependent on skin color. He cites specific examples of racial oppression, African Americans in the U.S. pre- and post-emancipation, American Indians, but not from the beginning. He's talked about the 19th century. We can talk about why and what happens in Virginia and why he's arguing it's not from the beginning, and the Irish in Ireland at 2 different periods. And he's focusing on the question of social control and the difference between racial and national oppression, and it has to do with the group that's in the middle. Under racial oppression, no member of the oppressed group really takes part in the oppression, is what he argues. Under national oppression, a sector of the oppressed group is used to help in the ruling class maintain social control. So in Virginia, no person of discernible non-European ancestry, any person were denied a role in social control group, but under national oppression in the Anglo-Caribbean, mulattoes were included, right? In the so-called free colors were included. One example, I'll just point to a number, but we can talk about all this more. In Jamaica, on the eve of emancipation, 30% of, I think it was, 30%, let me do my math. 30% of the enslaved African-American population were owned by people of color. I think it's 30, here's the number, 70 out of 310, maybe it's 23%, excuse me, I don't mean to over-exaggerate, but a significant number, qualitatively different than what we had in the US, right? Now there's much more to that story, but that's just to suggest, I think it's 23%, forgive me. Irish sea change. He also talks, and this should be of particular importance, particularly in Boston, but he talks a lot about New York, how Irish opponents of the British, they hated the British, they were racially oppressed by the British, Irish Catholics, and they come to the US and they become opponents of abolition, supporters of slavery, and supporters of racial oppression after a generation or two here. He talks about it in terms of the role of the plantation elite, the Catholic Church hierarchy, and Tammany Hall. He concludes chapter 1 talking about how after the Civil War and Reconstruction period, the ruling class of the North dominating the country ultimately decides on a system of social control based on what had been developed in the South, and they reestablish social control based on a system of racial oppression and racial privileges. 3 key areas: free land, immigration, and institutional employment. Immigration, basically a whites-only immigration policy. Free land, things like the Negro Exodus of 1879 get viciously beat back. And industrial employment, particularly in the South, the Cotton Mill Campaign, lily whites only. But he goes through a lot of this, right? Volume 2, this is, he considers, the basis of his life's work, right? This is what he was working on. And in it, I'm going to elaborate a little more. He makes certain arguments. White supremacism is not an inborn character of the European American personality. Racism is not innate. Racial oppression is not dependent on phenotype. An important link in understanding this is the reduction, we're going to talk about this, of laborers and tenants to chattel bond servants in the 1620s. And I'm going to jump ahead because I want to get to these points. In volume 2, 3 key years and dates he focuses on: 1622, 1676, Bacon's Rebellion, and 1705 when they revised the codes. He starts out talking about how England had developed agricultural capitalism, right? 1500s he's talking about this. By 1600s when they come, first, and he highlights again what I talked about, the enslavement of vagabonds in 1547 and 50. But England, this is capitalist agriculture. This is not feudalism in England. Allen goes through it, but he cites Marx and a host of other people here might be familiar with. The key labor law in England, and this is what they bring to Virginia, is the Statute of Artificers. Basic English labor law, it would remain the basic English labor law for 250 years, holds there would be no slavery and laborers were to be paid wages. That's what they come to Virginia with, the laws, right? He goes through in important detail a comparison of what develops in Haiti, Cuba, Puerto Rico, throughout the Americas. Before it turns to Virginia, he pays particular attention to factors like whether it's an insular island or a continental colony, whether there's significant social stratification or less, like the Aztecs and the Incas, or not, the population density. He looks at a lot of those factors to look at how social control systems are ultimately developed. And he argues that one of the key differences is, of all the European colonizing powers in the Americas, only England used European workers as basic plantation laborers in Anglo-America. And that's crucial because when they turn to this system, they've got so many laborers, they're not going to promote them all up to the middle class, because that's going to cut into their profits. So they have to start selling them another bill of goods. That's ultimately what it's going to be with this white race thing. He pays particular attention to the role of Africans in the history of the Americas. If people are not familiar with this, very important. More Africans and Europeans came to the Americas between 1500 and 1800, had a tremendous shaping influence on the entire hemisphere. He pays particular attention to African migration and resistance from the shores of Africa. The Haitian Revolution he calls special attention to for its liberating effect throughout the Americas, and also because it is from Haiti that Simon Bolivar twice leaves to go in his efforts to liberate South America, right? Virginia Company Charter, 1606, that the colonists shall have all liberties, franchises, immunities, and free denizens and natural subjects of England. This is going to be the law in Virginia. 15 more minutes, maybe 12. We're going quick, right? The Powhatan Indians are the Native Americans in the area of Jamestown. They are well provisioned. They're getting along fine when the English come. And the first year, 1609, 1610, the English actually go through what's called the starving time, phenomenally high mortality rate. Native Americans keep them alive. In the first decade or two, the English lacked the preponderance of force that the Spanish had brought into Peru and Mexico, you know, with those conquistadors and stuff. That wasn't the way the English were coming in. Before the first Africans come in 1619, before that, into the Virginia colony, right? Intermediate bond servitude, they start developing tobacco production. Tobacco is the crop that they're going to grow in Virginia, and that they do grow, and that's the basis of their plantation economy. And in the early period, as they start developing plantations, the plantation elite start taking advantage of vulnerable populations. Imprisoned convicts from England, vagrants being brought over against their will, maids for wives, women, and duty boys. Duty boys are youth. They first sent on a ship called the Duty. They're referred to as duty boys, right? First Africans come into the Virginia colony in 1619. Now at that time, the colonists, the colonial elite, are telling the people in England, well, gee, we got a shortage of food, you know, we need help. But they got no problem trading victuals, food, for 20 and odd Negroes who are on this ship that they purchase them from. But when those first Africans come, they are not enslaved because there's no slavery in Virginia, right? And but despite whatever they're telling the people in England, they had no problem because bringing more laborers helps reduce the cost of labor, you know, because in the beginning you have to understand, it's in Virginia, it's people are being paid wages or they're getting their tenants in halves. They're producing and they keep half what they produce and they turn over half to whoever owns the land. I mean, that's part of the period. Some of them are working for the company for a period of time and then they're going to get land. So and Allen goes through those, but they're capitalist relations of production. Here's a very important date. 22nd March 1622, the Powhatan Indians under their chief mount in relative terms the strongest effort ever made to halt the Anglo-American occupation of Indian lands. On that one day alone, they wipe out 1/3 of the Virginia colony, and within the next year another third would die. What this means is that for laboring and poor people who don't own anything, they're totally dependent. They can't go out and even grow anything, right? And because they're limited essentially to the confines of the fort or just barely beyond. So the ruling elite is in a power. This is what Naomi Klein's the golden opportunity for the shock doctrine, right? They seize on this opportunity to impose a new status of labor. In 1622, at the start of the year, the principal relation of production for laboring people in Virginia was tenant and half. There were also free wage laborers, right? So, but they're both capitalist relations of production. By the end of 1622, we see something new happening. The laboring people are committed to subort to a new status, the status of bond laborers, of chattel bond laborers. They can be bought and sold. This is a qualitative break from England, and they can be passed on to people's heirs. You start seeing heirs and assigns. They can be assigned to others. They are being treated as property, as chattel. It starts in 1622. There's not many Africans at this time, African Americans, but it's primarily Europeans that they're doing this to at first, because that's who's in the colony. Allen refers to it as the massacre of the tenantry, and what of course is important is they have their euphemisms back then, just like they do today. They refer to it as the custom of the country. But I can assure you, this is not indentured servitude as we're taught in all those books about people willingly signing contracts in Europe. It's being imposed as the custom of the country. Code words, right? Chattel bond servitude, as established in Virginia, is a qualitative break from the statute of artificers. It is not a feudal carryover. Under feudalism, it's a one-way bondage, but chattel, under feudalism, there's a two-way bondage. There's responsibility on both halves. This is a one-way bondage where you can be bought and sold, but you got no say over it. It's imposed as a custom of the country. Here's what some of the statistics are. Between 1607 and 1682, of 92,000 European immigrants brought to Virginia and Maryland, over 3/4 were chattel bond laborers, the great majority of them English. By the time of Bacon's Rebellion, 1,500 were arriving yearly. Such recruitment was generally coercive. Few were wholehearted volunteers. They're not signing. I mean, there's some people who signed indentures and they'll put them in the history books and put them online and say, look, but that's not what was really going on, right? And many were kidnapped. Some were ordinary convicts and still others were prisoners taken in rebellion, exiled under pain of death, etc. In the early period, the period of limited term chattel bond servitude, when they start setting up the chattel bond servitude, it's usually 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. It goes through different periods and different progressions. And they would generally extend a longer period either as a penalty or to vulnerable groups, right? But what's very important in this period of limited term chattel bond servitude is the total denial of family life, because this is going to change later on. Marriage was incompatible with chattel status, because if you're serving for 3 years, they don't want you to get pregnant and be out, for 9 months or a year and a half or whatever, because that's away from production. So they passed laws prohibiting fornication, adultery, and all of this stuff. Certainly the bond laborers didn't like that, right? And this would change qualitatively once they developed a system of racial slavery, because under racial slavery, if they're taking advantage of the enslaved women, their children are going to be enslaved, and then such things are not such a problem because you're adding more to the growth of capitalism, right? So, and in this early period, women exposed to special oppression, attacks on family life, particularly in 1643 a law is passed, first forbidden law, offending the wife's servitude. If a woman's serving 3 years and she gets married, she can be sentenced twice as long, whereas the husband's term would be extended by 12 months. And there's several other laws that Allen cites along these lines. In 17th century, now this is not the Kunta Kinte version of history. We were fed on TV when Kunta Kinte comes and it's a full-blown system of oppression, but it doesn't start like that, right? So in 17th century, Allen argues, as does Lerone Bennett in the chapter The Road Not Taken, the lives of African American and European American laborers and chattel bonds, and Morgan essentially makes this argument, were very similar up through 1676, at which time 3/4 of the chattel bond servants were European. Life expectancy of bond servants was low. I'm not saying this, and Bennett's phrase is, this was no Garden of Eden, right? People are dying young, they last a year or two, they're dying. And in 17th century, most of the plantation laborers were limited term bond laborers. The status of African Americans, Allen argues, in the 17th century exhibited many examples of normal class standing, particularly for the non-chattel bond servants among the African population, African descendant population. They exercised marriage rights, they exhibited social mobility, some had significant land holdings, some were owners of European bond laborers, they manifested many forms of resistance, and if they owned property, in the 17th century, African Americans could vote. Hear that, because that's going to change qualitatively. The status of African Americans, Allen argues, was indeterminate. It was still being struggled out. This wasn't set in stone from the beginning, right? And the record makes clear the relative status can be determined to have been indeterminate. Here's a very important case. There's a fellow named Gutman, writes a book many years ago on the black family and slavery and freedom. But he starts it in 1790, right? Wins a lot of awards too. But this is the case of Elizabeth Key. Elizabeth Key is a woman, child of a European American father and an African American mother. She is serving a period of bond servitude. Her parents die. She's scheduled to complete her term of servitude when the people who own the title to her labor, right, want to extend her to extended lifetime servitude. So she protests, as were African Americans were doing, even bond servants, right? She's a bond servant, and she protests, and she goes to court. And in 1656, in Virginia, the jury found Elizabeth Key entitled to her freedom based on two principles. One, traditional English principle that her Christian baptism and rearing barred her from being held as a lifetime bond laborer. Now, this first one, sometimes you could get it to work for you, other times it didn't. But but there was some history of this. But here's the second one, and I got my people who helped me with my Latin today. Second one is an English common law principle going back hundreds of years. In England, the status of the child followed that of the father. Partus sequitur patrum. It's the Latin, right? And it's going to change very quickly. That means you follow the status of your father. Her father's free, so she's supposed to be free. If those principles would have remained, we would have never had the system of racial slavery. Because when all those overseers and other European Americans and plantation owners took advantage of black women, the offspring would be free. So Virginia General Council, knowing which direction they were moving, quickly changed that, and they took a different course and said descent would go through the mother, partus sequitur. That's somebody correct me. Huh? I don't know, but I'll go with that. All right. But the point is, this is a qualitative change. This is a qualitative change, and you don't see this in the government, but I was talking about before. All right. So Allen's arguing the white race did not exist in this period, and although the bourgeoisie was pushing to extend servitude, and they were looking to, oppress in various ways. What's important to understand also is primary labor force still coming in and up through Bacon's Rebellion are European American chattel bondservants. The British don't get, the Second Dutch War is 1667 when there's a settlement. The Royal African Company is set up in 1672, and it wasn't really until the 1700s that it would really kick into action. So the numbers are, here's what the numbers are. In 1671, out of 8,000 bond laborers in Virginia, 6,000 European American, 2,000 African American. Between 1680 and 1700, another 30,000 Europeans would come, 24,000 were bond laborers. So that's still the increase in this early period. And number of Africans started to really increase too, but between 1674 and 1700, it's only 6,000. It would get much more heavy as we move into the 1700s. Bacon's Rebellion, when Bacon's Rebellion occurs, it's the second Civil War stage that Allen pays attention to. It starts out as within the ruling elite. The elite and sub-elite struggle over the rate of expropriation of Native American lands, but in the second Civil War stage, that's when the people at the bottom of society swing into action. In the period leading up to Bacon's Rebellion, there were 10 bond servant and laboring class rebellions. Allen argues Bacon's Rebellion made crystal clear that there was a lack of a substantial social control mechanism in Virginia, right? And social control, again, is what he's paying such attention to. The governor, William Berkeley, describes to have 6 parts of 7, at least, of the poor are indebted, discontented, and armed. This is what they were up against. And they kicked the governor out, as I said. They burned Jamestown. They controlled the land for 9 months. In response to Bacon's Rebellion, the ruling elite in Virginia decides to create a new social status. A white identity was to be designed not only to set European American laborers and bond laborers at a distance from the African Americans, but to enlist them as supporters of the ruling European elite, right? So the way it's done, and Allen goes through, and it's a whole codification of laws that start occurring in the latter 17th century, early 18th century. And what's important to understand are these are basic rights in England, but now they're being established as racial privileges here in Virginia. Presumption of liberty, right to get married, most of them are basic laws in England. Right to carry a gun, right to read and write, right to testify in legal proceedings. But it's not simply those privileges. There are specific laws directed against free African Americans, not only the chattel bond servants, denying free African Americans the right to hold any office, barring from bearing a witness. You're not going to have any more Elizabeth Key using the courts and stuff like that. Making any free Negro subject to 30 lashes for lifting his or her hand. This is a question of self-defense, which becomes so crucial in what happens. Forbidding possessing of any gun. Forbidding non-Europeans to be owners of Christian non-European, that is, European bond laborers. That was not enough. They used a means of propaganda. Today we have Fox News and all these other mechanisms for pushing those right-wing agendas. Back then they used the principal means that they had back then, and there was no separation of church and state on this one. Sometimes people use that phrase. We're almost done, another 8 or 10 minutes. The laws mandated that parish clerks had to publish these laws in full to the congregants. The sheriffs had to post them on the courthouse doors. This is how they were getting out the new rules about the white race and white privileges and special oppression of African Americans. Here's a key one, 1723. This is when they really start codifying some of the laws. Remember Winthrop Jordan, unthinking decision. Here's what happens in 1723. The Virginia Assembly passed an act providing that no free Negro mulatto, or Indian whatsoever shall have any vote at that election. In England, they didn't understand what was going on. They write to the colonies and say, what's going on? These people are property owners. Why can't they vote? So the governor of Virginia, William Gooch, had to set them straight. Well, here's how we do things in Virginia. And he explained it was done, and these are his words, to fix a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes. Allen argues, surely that was no unthinking decision. Rather, it was a deliberate act by the bourgeoisie, by the plantation bourgeoisie, and it repealed an electoral principle that existed in Virginia for more than a century. Going on, another important aspect of the 1723 codification was the denial of right of self-defense for African Americans, and this is particularly central to the development of the particular and peculiar American form of male supremacy, white male supremacy, which is informed by the principle that any European American male could assume familiarity with any African American woman, take away the right of self-defense. Why Allen then asks, as I said, Allen raises the questions that we all would ask and tries to address them. So why the exclusion of free African Americans? And I think this is very important. He goes, there was a marked tendency to promote a pride of race amongst, quote, white Americans. This was the real reason for the prescriptions against free African Americans. The exclusion of free African Americans from the intermediate stratum was a corollary of the establishment of the white race. You're going to set up this white race. If it's going to be the white race, you can't have black people. And we see that today, and people can, think about this, but this is a lot of the appeal of the Tea Party when they go after anything that's, public education, anything that's public, anything where black people are going to be included. We don't want that. We're against that, and it's very central, I think, still to the appeal. So Allen also argues how the laborers in Virginia were not being promoted out of their class. He cites the work of Jackson Turner Maine, Aubrey Land. It's very thorough. Allen was a political economist. He taught it at the Jefferson School, the Communist Party School for years. He's very knowledgeable, Marxian political economy, numbers. I mean, he knows what he's looking at and analyzing figures, and he goes through, talks about 60% of the white male population were not owners of bond laborers and were put in direct competition with the plantation bourgeoisie. I'm going to skip that one. He does talk, and I'm not going to go into it much here, although we can do it in the question and answer. He talks about social control in the British West Indies and why it takes a different form, right? And it's got to do with the limited land. In the West Indies in general, in the Caribbean, it's sugar production. That's much more capital intensive, and there's all this pressure for smaller owners of land and trying to, make a go of it to leave. There's a substantial Irish presence, disproportionate Irish presence. This is a period when Irish are fighting the British tooth and nail, right? There's stationing of English military and naval forces in the Caribbean, which can help put down reductions. There's a predominance of the demographics are very much more heavily African descended there. And then increasingly there's a reliance on persons of African descent in the skilled trades and women, particularly in the internal economy. So these are reasons, he argues, why ultimately the same Anglo-bourgeoisie that establishes racial oppression in the U.S. establishes national oppression in the Anglo-Caribbean. I encourage people to read that. Wrapping up, last 7 slides. Allen argues the white race social control formation became a model. It was invented. Its distinguishing characteristic was the participation of European American laboring classes. In time, what they developed in Virginia and Maryland would serve as the model as the plantation economies moved south. He finishes volume 2 in 1997. What he writes 16 years ago could apply today. He writes, now at the end of the 20th century, the social gap between the Titans and the common people is perhaps at its historic maximum. Now it's at its historic maximum, right? And wages have tended downward for nearly 2 decades. Entitlements and welfare have become obscenities. There is less of a socialist movement today than 100 years ago. They closed down government, they lay off people. Where's the protest, right? Class struggle. We talked about the working class in any of the debates that we ever hear, right? I mean, on TV. Is an epithet cast accusingly at the mildest offenders of social welfare, and the country is loud with the sound of one class. That's what we get on TV all the time, one class, 2 component parts. Allen described, however, unmistakable signs of maturing social conflict because of intensifying efforts to balance. He knows that the conflict is developing. He emphasizes the important fact that we still bear the indelible mark, the indelible stamp of those struggles of the 60s. We've learned some lessons that we can build off. His final words, perhaps by virtue of that legacy, in the impending renewal and impending struggle, perhaps European Americans will begin to pick up the struggle and fight against white privileges and white supremacy and help push this struggle forward. This is when he finishes his book. Here's the last 4 slides as we look ahead for all of us in this room. I would suggest it's important to remember what Allen argues has happened in the three previous periods of national crisis, that the key to defeat of the forces in each one case was achieved by ruling class appeals to white supremacism and by fostering white skin privileges. I think we should understand the crucial importance of anti-white supremacist struggle at all stages, but when Allen describes that 5-stage struggle, it's particularly important between stages 3 and 4 that we know what's coming. They're going to try and use white supremacy. As we start to come together, they're going to try and use white supremacy to beat us back. So we've got to really be sharp and honed in and focused to fight, to fight that effort. Remember the insights of Hubert Harrison, that politically the Negro is the touchstone. Every issue we look at in society, let's see how black people are faring and what are we going to do about it, right? And understand the importance of what Harrison saw 50 years in advance and what we should have learned from the 60s, that basic struggle for equality and rights implies a revolution startling to even think of. It's a catalyst for so much that we want to do. And then remember from Allen, the white race was created and has been maintained by the ruling class as a ruling class social control formation. It serves their interest. It's the principal historic guarantor. And remember from both Harrison and Allen that efforts at radical social change in the U.S. should understand and reflect the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy. That's the end. Yes.
At the very beginning,
Wait, excuse me, before we start questions, I'm sorry,
No.
if we could.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. They wanted to do a...
Yeah, but also, first of all, welcome to the CME. This was this was really terrific. You have books for sale?
Everything it costs. Sean, can you get more maybe?
Sure.
Yeah, we have more. Oh, yeah.
Do you want to,
Yeah, let me just explain. Cut the camera.
and since the CME wants to continue to have events like this, and has been, we have to pay the rent. And every month it's a struggle. So I will ask people to chip in whatever they can. It would be very much appreciated. And in terms of questions, the only thing that I ask is wait until everyone's asked their question before you ask us, have your second question. You can deal with your own. It's like you're more than capable.
No. Go for it. We had a question here first. Do you have a question, Doug?
Yeah.
We'll start here. You got the
at the
first.
very beginning of your presentation, you mentioned something about the arrogance of the Americans towards Africans in the continent. I make frequent trips there, so I'm interested in what you meant by that.
No. I didn't say Africa. The arrogance of people from this country towards people of Africa. That's what James is talking about, right? No, yeah. If I misspoke or you misunderstood, whatever it was, that's not what intended. James is more talking about how people from this country, so generally and overwhelmingly, have had that arrogance towards people from Africa. And thank you, though, for make sure I keep it right. Yes, Doug.
I was just going to point out, in Du Bois's work about black Reconstruction, he does categorize slaves as black proletariat and how American labor essentially betrayed them. And it's interesting if you compare it to, say, Europe, where during the Civil War, French and English workers thrown out of their jobs because they couldn't get, cotton to work the textile mills. They were willing to suffer through that and engage in solidarity actions because they saw solidarity with Union soldiers and slaves as more important than their jobs. And that agitation would lead to a mass revival of the labor movement in the continental and England. And also how it's interesting how the year after the end of Reconstruction that there was the massive railroad strikes across the country, which were ultimately another defeat for U.S. labor and helped solidify.
I just want to point out on some of these topics and the role of U.S. labor in the 1800s. If people get a chance to look at the article on the developing conjuncture, that my article up there, which draws from Allen. His final book, that never got, we're gonna get it published, right? It's not published, is Towards a Revolution in Labor History, where it starts from that premise which we talked about understanding slavery as capitalism, and comes all the way through, and he pays particular attention to some of these, the positions labor, and talking about how the Chartists in England can oppose slavery in the U.S., the labor movement and the Working Men's Association, even William Silvis take bad stands here in the U.S., for those familiar with the labor history. So I think you'll find that particularly interesting. Sorry. Yes?
What do you make of somebody like Jimmy Boggs, as he's referred to by his widow, Grace Boggs?
Yeah.
In his work, that's one question, and in relation to all this. But the other thing is, what do you think is the meaning of all of this for now, especially in the light of what I think is kind of a pushing aside of a lot of this by demographic changes that are driven largely by new immigration, where we now have new immigrants from Mexico and other parts of the world that seem to be kind of, in some ways, overshadowing this history, however you wish to interpret it.
Very briefly, in terms of the two things, I mean, I've read some of Boggs, and over the years, for many years, I like Boggs, and I like the work they do. Regarding the demographic change, what Allen argues is simple demographics isn't going to change it. The ruling class has found ways. I mean, people have written books. You mentioned, I think it was you who mentioned Ignatieff earlier. He talks how the Irish became white. There are books how the Italians became white, how the Jews became, right? And what I pointed out earlier, and you're mentioning, I think you mentioned Mexicans right now, that census, what's going on with the census, we have to pay attention to that. It's not an automatic that, I mean, this is much more involved. I really recommend people look at that article on the race and the census, because it's a complex issue, but I think we all want to pay attention, as you're suggesting, to these demographics. But Allen argues, before he dies in 2005, he goes, I don't think a simple demographic bypass is going to solve this, because the ruling class can employ much to divert that and to move it in different directions. And I've written some things on that also. I have an article which people may want to look at. It appeared in some of the Black Agenda Report, Black Commentator, Counterpunch, on the Lautenberg Amendment. I don't know if people here are familiar with it. I'm from Jersey. He's our senator, right? And it's on immigration. And it talks how certain groups are given special refugee status. Usually for an immigrant, you have to come, you go through a one-by-one immigration appeal. Even if you apply as a refugee, you go one by one. It's a very torturous, very difficult process, and so many people, again, that you're talking about, are referred to, people coming to the U.S., oftentimes as, quote, illegal immigrants, illegal aliens, right? Under the Lautenberg Amendment, you could be a felon, if you're covered by the Lautenberg Amendment, a felon in the former Soviet Union, a felon, and you could come and arrive at Kennedy Airport, claim you're covered by the Lautenberg Amendment, you're presumed to be legal, and you have access to all kinds of government programs. The same kind of programs that the black youth on 125th Street who gets picked up for 2 ounces of pot is denied public housing, public this, public that. So please, that article, my name, the Lautenberg Amendment, I worded it carefully because I know how the attacks are going to come, but read it. It's very instructive in terms of immigration policy. Any people working in immigration policy and areas, I recommend you look at it and become familiar with it, because they buried it since 1989. It gets re-upped every year. Yes.
Do you believe that African Americans in this country today constitute a nation?
Allen, I'll tell you what Allen says. Do African Americans in this country constitute a nation? Right? That's part of the history of the left. Allen comes out of the Communist Party, knows that theory well, and that's where I started. When I came to Harrison, not that you asked, but I'm coming to your question. I started out, I'm working in the post office, but I'm influenced a little by Allen's early work, even before I knew him very well, and I start out writing a dissertation.
You done with this?
Keep it there in case we need some. And I'm addressing why no socialism in this country. I'm looking particularly at questions of race and class. So I'm reading all the early socialist and communist literature. I'm very familiar with the position. I interviewed some of the people who went to the 6th Comintern Congress. You know, I've got some of the original documents that people haven't seen. I mean, I've been at this a long time. So I'm familiar with that. But here's what Allen says when asked that question. He goes, well, if African American comrades ask me if there's a Negro nation or a black nation, you know, or anything like that, and even before that, Harrison, before I get to Allen, Harrison in 1924 in his International Colored Unity League, he actually starts arguing for a separate state for African Americans in the U.S. This is years before the Comintern and all of that. So you might want to read. And that essay was written right up here in the Boston Chronicle, and it's included in this thing where I have a number of articles by Harrison in the Boston Chronicle. But here's what Allen says. Allen says, well, if African Americans ask me if I think there's a black nation or not in the U.S., he goes, if I had an opinion, he goes, I believe in the right of self-determination. African Americans probably be the determinants of that question. But he goes, so if I had an opinion I felt worth offering, I would. He goes, but I would certainly begin by arguing that I don't think there's a white nation. Oh. Yes. Hi.
Hi. I started my political involvement with the city, and I was fortunate to be in SNCC, and I met Malcolm X during the 1963 March on Washington that night. A lot of people don't know he was in Washington. My twin brother was there when he was assassinated. Now Malcolm was very clear about the role of the Democratic Party. He used to call John Kennedy, John the Fox Kennedy. And many of his speeches are available online. My question to you is, the role of the Democratic Party in the suppression of the class struggle in this country. What do you think the role that has been and is continuing to be? Oh, by the way, I worked 48 years in the building trades, and that is a really white job
Right.
trust.
Right. Well, I'm very pleased you're here, very pleased to meet you, and I'd actually like to talk to you later, too,
Yeah.
because I have some questions. You came in a little late. You might not have heard about the early discussion about Say Brother in the early years, and Ray Richardson, who's Harrison's grandson. You know, I don't know if you heard that, but I would like to talk. If you remember, you were in Boston.
Yes, I
in
remember.
right. And, I mean, we have more time, just a little bit. If you go on the webpage, you're going to
I
see...
have your book.
Yeah, if you go on the webpage, you'll see Yuri Kochiyama, who's the one who gives mouth to mouth to Malcolm at the Audubon Ballroom, holding up her Harrison books. I mean, you know, there's roots on a lot of this stuff.
I have your book.
Good. Now, regarding Democratic Party, I gave the example of the Democratic Party during the Depression, which many people consider the Democratic Party at its best, right? And what I spoke about back then was how they were tied and tethered to the Dixiecrats. And what Allen writes, I'll talk about what Allen writes. What Allen writes is that the left and the CP and everything made a vast mistake by following that leadership too much, getting subsumed and biting their tongue on the fight against white supremacy, holding it back. So that's the core argument. And in general, I mean, that's it. I don't spend my time with the Democratic Party particularly, right? And I'm thinking we got to build a movement here. It's got to stop putting pressure, come from below, understanding the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy, and coming from this class perspective where we want to change the whole social structure. We want to change things for working people and poor people. We want to end racial, gender oppression, these things. Yes. So I'm sorry, I hope that's a partial answer, at least. No?
I just wondered about
1 second.
To me,
I get you.
it's clear that there's some confusion, I think, now. I agree that the white concept of race was created in 4 centuries and is underscored by the mass forced migration of Africans to this hemisphere. But there's an ongoing discussion about Obama being a movement, as if one president can displace 1 million in the jails. I wonder what
Very briefly, I'm going to talk in terms of Allen again, and I'm going to talk in terms of Obama. Before Allen died, I asked him, I said, well, gee, you know, you've got athletes making a lot of money, you know, some black athletes making a lot of money, Johnson, you know, you got some people and stuff. I go, do you think that this racial oppression he's describing is changing to national oppression in the U.S.? He goes, I don't think that there's a black bourgeoisie that is pushing their own demand, the demands of the black, that is representing the black community, pushing the demands. And from what I have seen, although Barack Obama may reflect the aspirations of aspects of the African American community, I don't see that he and his administration is pushing those demands. And I'll use the example of the job situation for one. You come from, right? I mean, that 2-to-1 unemployment ratio hadn't been changed, and you know, conditions have worsened, right? And there are others. But so just, I mean, in general, that would be my answer on that. Okay? Yes.
That's a brief answer for all the garbage we know about his history.
Well, yeah, I
His
mean,
connections. Okay, well, we'll just let that go right now. Forget the CIA and all that. Anyway, a question and then a comment. Not a very profound comment, but a question was, you mentioned an author who recently had written a book about what the real intentions, the real consequences of the new.
Oh, Ira Katznelson. He's at Columbia.
Ira
Katznelson, and he's written another book recently that
wait
came
a
out
minute.
too.
K-A-T-Z.
Znelson, and he's very good. And
And what's the name of the book?
When Affirmative Action Was White. I don't have the title right now.
Is that the new one or the
no?
old
That's the one I referred to. But what's
He's reading a history of the New Deal.
right? A history of the New Deal.
Okay, I'll just Google him. Alrighty.
Say it again.
End of Fear. I think.
End of Fear, right? So I mean, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I've had some friends describe
Okay.
it. One thing I want to point out where I differ with Katznelson, then I want to point out one thing that I like about Katznelson. Another thing where I differ is I think he argues that the white workers are benefiting from a lot of these New Deal policies. That's where I think I would differ from some of the things going back. But one thing that I found very fascinating, I spoke recently at the Schomburg Center in New York on Harrison, and Kamosi Woodard, who's a historian, was chairing the thing, and we were talking afterwards. He goes, Jeff, because I mentioned Katznelson, right? He goes, did you know that Katznelson, when he was doing his doctoral dissertation, he really wanted to do Hubert Harrison, but he couldn't find the materials, which I found very interesting, because he understood how important Harrison was. And the story on Harrison, not that I want to bore anybody with this, but when I started out addressing why no socialism, and I'm reading all the literature I can from the turn of the 20th century, and I have hundreds and hundreds of archival boxes of material, and I've been working at this a long time. And then I came across J.A. Rogers, Richard B. Moore, who's in the Communist Party, a couple of other people. They write these essays on Hubert Harrison, and I say, who is this guy? So I go to the Schomburg Center, and I crank them out on microfilm, and I take them home and I read them, and I dropped everything I was doing, and I said, this guy's too important. Winston James, a friend of mine, said he had the exact same response when he encounters Harrison. He is head and shoulders above all his contemporaries in his understanding of these issues in race and class. I say that unequivocally. We can talk about, when we do Harrison, I want to talk about World War I, his differences with Du Bois, Booker T. I mean, this stuff is fascinating, right? But Harrison is head and shoulders above all of these people. So, and I forget where I was going with that. That's something like that.
I just have a comment that I want to make.
Oh, yeah. Can I finish?
Oh, sure. Go
Yeah.
right ahead.
So how I came. So I turned to Harrison. I wanted to write about Harrison, and I wrote a couple hundred pages. And back then, this is the early 80s, computers were a little, I mean, I remember when they were block long, but I could write the same letter and change who it was going to and send it 25 places. So I sent letters all over trying to get some more leads on Harrison. And the librarian in the Virgin Islands writes back and says, oh, I'm related to his family. His son lives on 150th Street, and his daughter lives in Yonkers. So I go meet them, and I bring my 200 pages, and I say, well, I'd like to write on your father. And I'm okay. And, and we, understandably, well, you want to write about our dad, And on the third meeting, after they read what I left them and we talked, they take me into the front room, and since 1927, they had preserved all his papers, right? And they trusted me, and they told me, do what you need to do with these papers. So what I did, essentially, was I got about $1,000 together. I go, because I'm working in the post office, right? And I go and I become an archivist overnight. I get Mylar, I get the acid-free paper, the archival boxes, and every day, we call this proletarian scholarship, every day after work, would, just transcribe, document after just absorbing in it, and setting up an inventory and index. Now, I forgot to mention this, but Hubert Harrison, his papers are now at Columbia University. I'll explain how that happened. They're at Columbia University, and the 102-page inventory, essentially, which I did, is available online. So it's for free. You can go get through Columbia's library catalog or through my webpage. You can go get it. Something people, I think, want to have at least, PDF on their computer. It's very good stuff. And the decision, ultimately, we talked to Harvard, we talked to Princeton, Columbia, Yale, Schomburg Center, Library of Congress about the papers, because Harrison is one of the founders of the library. And Howard Dodson was there before, now he's at Howard, he was in charge. And, people wanted to, the family made the final decision, and part of that reason was because Winston James, who was at Columbia at the time, and also worked on the Schomburg, on the Scholars and he said, basically what he said was, he says, Howard may want to do lots of things, but it's a public institution. He may not be here for however long. And he goes, I think, based on his experience, I think it would be best for the family at Columbia. The family decided on that. It's still in New York, and accessible. But we got more out of that arrangement, including the commitment to Columbia to allow me to, these papers that I've been transcribing and stuff, to put all 700 writings on the web for free, permanent searchable database, not getting paid a penny, but we've got that commitment, so he will be available forever, and that's trying to bring it to the public, right, and to the masses. Harrison style. And, so that's part of the background. Sorry.
The comment I
Yes.
wanted to make, just for your, whatever you could say about it. I listen a lot to just radio. I don't have a TV, so there's constant, and I understand the constant promoting of we're all middle class. And the whole ignorance of that there's any thing called a working class or working poor. Actually, I think I heard some black woman use that term today on our program, but it's so rare, and so we're all middle class. But the thing that really gulls me, I'm not quite sure what to do about this, is NPR, all these elitist intellectuals, I think they're, that are broadcasting every day, constantly talking about race and race discrimination and what race this person is, what race that person is. And I'm thinking, these are people who identify with all these grand university communities around here, where scientists have been telling them now for decades there is no such thing as race. So it just seems like the insidious propaganda mill is there to convince us that it's racial conflict and class. We're all the same class.
Well, what I want to say is we can never lose sight of the fact that we're in the most powerful capitalist country in the world. And the ideas of the ruling class in all their forms are the ideas of this society. So we're getting hit with it in every way. In terms of the actual class, I'm going to get to you in 1 second. In terms of the class breakdown, that article I did on a developing conjuncture, the statistics are 3 years old, but they could easily be updated. And if you read them, they're staggering. About 50% of the children born in the U.S. today are going to be on food stamps. This is 3 years ago. 90% of the African American kids, these numbers are staggering. Poverty level. You have to read this. I mean, that's not what we get from these people. And yes, I agree with you, in these elite institutions, the level of discussion and discourse, they don't get at it at all, right? And but we have to push, and we have to develop our analysis. And one thing, I think we can do it. I think we can all, and we all have a role to play in this, and we all have a part, and we have to keep continuing plugging. When I started on Harrison, I can go back to the early 2000s, and if you Googled Hubert Harrison, you'd get 8 hits or something like that. I mean, it's changed. And what I see, I'll go places like here, and somebody will say, oh, I read the book, or I saw you, and it's not me. I mean, I'm writing about these people. I know what's important in what I do. It's the people I write about. But that goes on. It gets out. People get it. They disseminate. Wilson Moses, a very fine historian, said, I had done my dissertation at Columbia, and part of the struggle at Columbia, when I finished my dissertation in 1987, it was ready to be published. I went to the Historians Convention, and the first table I went to Louisiana State. They used to be big in black studies way back, and they got regional since then. That's another one of those code words, right? When they get regional. They said, oh, we'd love to publish your book, no problems. Then I take Harrison's daughter, I finish my orals and stuff, and I'm still in the post office, I take Harrison's daughter to a restaurant in New York, B. Smith's restaurant, if anybody knows. And we go, a big splurge for me, and we have dinner. At the end of the meal, I'm written 810-page dissertation. She goes, here, I got one more thing for you. She gives me his diary. I had no idea it existed, right? And it is major, and you'll see his comments in here from his diary, and this is only a taste of it, right? It's incredible, right? So I go to LSU and I say, this has got to be a 2-volume biography, and the reviews come back in on volume 1, and they're through the roof. Not because I let Harrison speak. I'm smart enough to do that, right? And they say, well, can you turn it into 1 volume? And I say, no, it should be a 2-volume biography. Now I was their union head of a 4,000 worker of a mail handler union in a 4,000 worker facility at the time. So they weren't going to break me about tenure and all this shit because I wasn't doing that, right? I said no, 2 volumes. So I went through 3 rounds of having it go out. The reviews come in through the roof, and they don't know what to do. Who's Hubert Harrison and who are you? What are you talking about 2 volumes? But I insisted 2 volumes, and that's the way it was going to be. And that finally we went to Columbia. Winston James had suggested go to Columbia. They said we can't do the contract unless you don't have a contract with LSU, so I broke the contract and I went there. But there's a lot of pressure in the academy, what you're talking about, in terms, even for the young people coming up, follow the line of your professors and this and that. And one of the problems with Harrison, it was explaining Harrison, is, and this is why I look to the younger generation, is he's a total giant, without a doubt, anybody who really reads him. But most people have never heard of him, and he's not taught for the most part in universities. And I think it's a bit hard for somebody who's been a professor of history or whatever, for 30, 40 years, to say, gee, this Harrison is a giant. Because you got a little explaining to do. What have you been doing for 30 or 40 years? And so it's going to be the younger people, I think, particularly. And that's why when I said early, I think he's going to be talking increasingly to the younger generation. I think that's the case. And I know young scholars now who are coming up and working on Harrison. We're in touch, and I, do what I can to, share what I know.
I have to leave.
Yeah, thank you.
So is there any way we can get your book?
Yeah, right now. My friend Sean, Sean is there. Yeah, he's got and everything it cost, and thank you for coming very much. Thank you for coming.
And people can stay and ask you.
Yeah, sure, yes, sure. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just a thought. I used to be a census worker, and I remember, well, I'll tell you 2 stories about being a census worker, because they're connected together for me. One was running around with the paperwork, and my job as an enumerator was to say to people, oh, you forgot to send in your form, let me help you with it. And we would be prompting people to answer the question, what race do you consider yourself to be? And it occurred to me, this is fucked up. The other is that in that job, I had a boss who was a former Marine, sat me down in his van one day, and he was upset because he had given me a particular bundle of assignments, and I had traded it to somebody who wasn't as good at this, and they needed an easier assignment. And he was offended at me for refusing the white privilege which he had given me. I didn't even realize that's what was going on. He said to me, these are his words, when God gives you a gift, you take it. And he was referring to the system of white privilege.
Right.
It's God to these guys.
You're right. Well, we got to challenge. On my webpage, for those who are interested, as I said, I worked in the post office for all these years. On my webpage, I talk about how in the post office, amongst working people, I tried to put in practice what we're talking here. We put the struggle against white supremacy central in workplace organizing. We challenged all these discriminatory things, the white privileges. First, there was a lot of people, ready to go to blows and stuff, but we really built extraordinary labor solidarity. Jersey City, I don't know if people know Jersey City. It's a little bit like South Boston, parts of Boston and stuff like that. We had 3 out of 4,000 workers wearing anti-apartheid button. People who had never in their life would dream of doing this in 1986. Thank you very much.
Excuse me.
What's your first name?
This sure can.
Sydney was
So
there.
pass it around
Good
again.
side.
And if anyone hasn't this didn't go around. If you're not on the CME mail list, you may want to be.
Anybody need it? Is everyone?
Yeah, just leave it there.
But I don't live far away, and I
Okay.
Massachusetts.
So,
You're here, you teach, you work, well, I'm a yeah.
I see if there's any more questions.
I'm gonna have, no, I think we broke up, but people can talk